We're CE here. Yeah, we're in CE. All right, welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we are going to go over topic 3.3, belief systems of empires here, roughly between circa 1450 to 1750 CE. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right. So, the essential question for you in this topic, the thing that you need to be able to explain is be able to answer in detail this question right here, which ties again, basically putting the AP learning objective into a question form, which is how did different belief systems endure or change during the period from 1450 to 1750? So this is definitely a continuity and change skill that I'm sure you've learned about in your AP classes, as is the skill you're supposed to be able to do is continuity and change, meaning when you're looking at a topic of some kind, how has it changed or stayed the same through history? And religion, of course, is a big one, right? As many religions endure for long periods of time, but they can also change. You know what I mean? So, seeing how that's going to be affected here. All right, so just setting the stage a little bit. As far as Christianity goes, Christianity remained a dominant force in Europe, and had since the fall of the Roman Empire. The institution that has been most enduring since the fall of Rome has been Christianity. States have come and gone, but Christianity has remained a huge part of European civilization ever since. But what we do see in this time period, and which is a major point of study for this time period, is the split of Christianity into several factions during the 16th and 17th centuries in what's called the Protestant Reformation. And that's a major thing we'll be studying here today. And then going east from Europe into the Islamic empires of the Ottomans and the Safavids, you see a deepening of the split between the two major sects of Islam, which are Sunni and Shia, with both of those empires kind of representing different sects and highlighting those. And then also in India, we get development of Sikhism, which combine Hindu and Sufi Muslim beliefs over in India. And the India story under the Mughal Empire is definitely a point of focus too. Okay. All right. So the Catholic Church really was at its powerful height in the years of feudalism in Europe throughout what we can kind of consider the Middle Ages, right, of Europe. It was deep entrenched in society and found a strong hold within the feudal structure, as the church played a big role in the role of societies. And one of the things we've seen, and we've seen just in this unit already, is the centralization of governments in Europe, and including the creation of new powerful kingdoms, absolute monarchies, and that sort of thing. And the Catholic Church was definitely challenged with this shift. It was weakened by that. And one thing that happened during this kind of centralization process and the power, really the height of the church, was its susceptibility to corruption due to how large of an influence it was, not just religiously, but also politically, right? As church affairs played a large role in political affairs. And you will see in this the church's response with councils and reform movements, but in a nutshell, kind of as part of the Protestant Reformation, the church's response will never be fully successful and will never be close to having the power it once had. So starting with what's called the Protestant Reformation, the roots of it really come from theological disputes. Okay, theological disagreements about Christian doctrines, and some of the early kind of theological arguments that got became a point of discussion were a couple of them. One, John Wycliffe. So he argued back in the 14th century, so in the 1300s, that priests were unnecessary for salvation. This might have been a response to the fact that they felt priests were becoming maybe more worldly, possibly more corrupt, and again, not seeing them as necessary for an actual salvation. And one thing that he was kind of a proponent of, and you're going to see is one of the key things that was part of the Protestant Reformation, was getting more access of the Bible to regular people, because the Bible was still exclusively written in Latin, which was a language that really only the church could be able to read and interpret. Basically gave them a monopoly on Scripture. And Wycliffe was basically vilified for translating parts of the Bible into English, because that was seen as unacceptable by the church and wanting to be in its more Latin form. Now, another group, for example, also is the Hussites, who are followers of Jan Hus in Bohemia, and they were declared heretics because they had a lot of the same beliefs as Wycliffe, and actually Hus was actually burned at the stake. So you can see early on here that the church is taking this very seriously, these theological disputes, and definitely see them potentially as a threat. Some other ones, for example, and this is one of the things you're going to see with these, what are going to be called Protestant religions down the line, is really the emphasis on Scripture, right? And one thing that kind of became a common theological issue that people had was that the church, over centuries of development, was getting further and further away from the teachings itself, and that a lot of the religious traditions were not something necessarily that were biblical doctrine. So kind of a returning to the Christian Bible there. So Huldrych Zwingli, for example, he campaigned for basically religion in Geneva, Switzerland, where he's going to be, to try to follow the exact teachings of Scripture and discard a lot of the customs that are going to be created later on by church traditions and those sort of things. For example, didn't see that celibacy, right, for clergymen to not be able to have wives and children and stuff like that. Didn't see that that was actually biblical in nature, so opposing that. So again, if it's basically this idea of if it's not in the Bible, then it's not necessary, right, or not true or anything like that. What the Bible says, and it's pure, and it's in its perfect form there. That's what is a commonality amongst a lot of these people with theological disagreements. Okay, well, another thing that the church was having an issue with this time than Christianity. So Christianity is having a few issues. You got these theological disputes that are happening, but also some other things that were happening as well. So one, for example, was church power suffering during what's called the Babylonian captivity, which you can see from in this many of the decades in the 1300s. The papacy basically relocated to France for a while, Avignon specifically, which may have suffered that because the church's stronghold was definitely there in, Italy. Now, one thing that definitely happened as a result of the Babylonian captivity, though, was that the French rulers had greater influence over the church, right? So, for example, French rulers had an ability and had input on who should be the pope. French rulers were seeking land. French rulers that were seeking land were confiscating it from monasteries because the church had incredible amounts of land ownership during this time. Those monasteries and church property were very, very valuable, and as French rulers were gaining more power and prestige, they wanted some of that. Now, one of the other things that was really a blow to church authority was the Black Death, the plague, right, which starts here in the same time during the Babylonian captivity, but here in the mid 1300s, because people were looking to the church to try to find an answer for the Black Plague. Or the Black Death. Why was it happening? Was it religious in nature? Was it supernatural in nature? It was God intervening in some way for people's sins, or any kind of theological explanation there. And when the church was basically unable to stop the plague and unable to again stop those effects, church authority definitely suffered as a result of that, for sure. I mean, it's not going to go away, of course, or anything like that, but it will definitely suffer for some of those people. Okay, now the biggest blow specifically into the Catholic Church, and the most important part of the Protestant Reformation, comes down to development of Lutheranism from Martin Luther. So Martin Luther has an interesting story just to add to this, a little bit of background. He is from Germany, and he wanted to, and he was kind of young, become a lawyer. He was in law school, and that's what he was pursuing. And one of the famous stories about Martin Luther was that he was traveling, and during his travels, he was caught in a really, I guess, violent lightning storm, right? And in this kind of storm, he feared for his life and basically knelt down to pray, basically saying, "God, if you will spare me, I will devote my life to you. I'll become a monk." And he survived this ordeal and fairly promptly, dropped out of law school and joined a seminary, and eventually became, a monk. And in his studies, he was somebody again with kind of the law background and kind of the acquisitive mind and things like that. As now an insider into the church, over time and through his research, through his experiences, made some conclusions that there were several church traditions that violated biblical teachings. Okay, that they violated biblical teachings. And one of the things that they say really set him off was his objection to the sale of indulgences, which had become quite common at this time. So indulgences, in a nutshell, is when somebody can basically pay like a donation pretty much to the church, which granted you absolution from your sins, specifically, I believe, reducing the time a soul has to spend in purgatory, which was a common belief in the Middle Ages. So he saw this as basically an immoral practice, saying that this selling of indulgences actually has no spiritual value, and he objected to that. Another one that he objected to was to the practice of simony, which is basically selling of church offices. It seemed that was a somewhat common practice in his time, that offices could got to go to the highest bidder. So with these grievances, and as a result, also something to add to this is also the era of the printing press, right? Johann Gutenberg printing press is a powerful tool right now, and it's something that Martin Luther uses, and would probably not have had success without it because he started publishing. Right now, the famous thing was that Luther was challenging the church and did this kind of famous thing of coming up with this list, 95 theses, 95 things, grievances he has specifically towards indulgences, and nailed it to the church door in Wittenberg, basically for all to see, because the church door also almost served like almost like a public bulletin board in a way. But anyways, this thing he wrote it up, and then it got published. And it got published and actually started basically spreading like wildfire throughout Germany. And before long, the church got wind of this and some of the grumblings that people were having. But again, just going back, this was a big deal, especially they say kind of the nail in the coffin was the selling of indulgences. And specifically, actually, when the most famous indulgence priest, someone that had been employed by the church to sell these indulgences, Johann Tetzel, they were raising money for, I believe, remodeling St. Peter's Cathedral and that sort of and that thing, and were using this money, and they were on this big campaign. And Johann Tetzel came to Wittenberg, and again, he was like the most famous of these indulgence priests, and came into Wittenberg, and he was kind of like a celebrity, and shows up and basically gives this big speech about, almost like guilt tripping people in a way, like, can't you hear from beyond the grave? Your ancestors are crying for your help in purgatory. You know what I mean? Because indulgences, you could buy them for yourself, right, to absolve some of your sins for the afterlife or whatever, but also apparently for ancestors as well. So he saw this and saw people, of course, in his parish or whatever, and it really bothered him. And that was kind of, they say, one of the final straws for Martin Luther there. So, what ends up happening is he really kind of turns to the Bible, which again was one of the common things that the Protestant Reformation did, which was return to the Bible and really start to look at it through a new lens, a more maybe non-biased lens or whatever. And one of the big things that Luther was advocating for was actually, how do you become saved? And he really advocated for this position that means sola fide, which means faith alone are you saved. Not from your actions in life, not through good deeds, not through all these other actions. It's through faith alone, right? Now, the church outright rejected this because there were a lot of practices and rituals and things like that the church, of course, offered that was a key part of Christian life. I mean, really, the Middle Ages Christian church was at the key of, or at the center of almost every important life moment, from when you're born, having a church observed baptism, and then like your first communion, and being there for your wedding, and observing that, and your last rites, and all these different things. And of course, a lot of these things came with a price, as you paid for these services. So the whole sola fide idea and not needing church services would not just be a theological issue that the church would want to dispute, but also would be an economic issue, as a giant amount of revenue comes from those church practices. So to kind of summarize the story, and there's a lot more you can research in this, he basically was put on the spot and in front of church council, saying, do you actually agree with these things? Do you mean them? Do you take them back? And Luther doesn't, and promptly the Pope Leo X, excommunicated Martin Luther. Now, this was a big moment for a lot of reasons. One is it's going to provide a split with Luther, but also by this time, Luther had become very popular amongst a lot of people, Germans, of course. And it wasn't just regular people that have issues with the church. Political leaders also found an opportunity with what Luther was doing. For example, there's a lot of German princes, a lot of German states that did not like being ruled necessarily by the Holy Roman Empire, and wanted more autonomy, and almost saw Luther's kind of protests and things as a vehicle for possibly getting more autonomy directly from from the Pope, which was worked very much hand in hand a lot with the Holy Roman Empire. So they saw an opportunity by supporting Luther. So Luther had the support of a lot of different people. He had it from common people who may have seen the issues with the church, from other priests like himself, monks or priests like himself that agreed with him on some of the theological issues, and then political leaders hoping to use this to kind of merge this into maybe a political movement for more autonomy. So the famous one was the Diet of Worms, which was where basically he was ordered to, or asked and given an opportunity to recant or take back his criticisms of the church. And he refused to do so, kind of famously here. And this became just a big event for the Germans because he had become very, very popular by this time. But anyway, he denies or rejects the whole idea of recanting, doesn't want to take it back. He gets excommunicated. Now, this is, again, a big moment because it also is going to provide a split, which we'll see here in just a second. Now, like I was saying, there was a lot of people, upper class and lower peasant class, that were also seeing the opportunity under what Luther was doing for political or social revolution. For social revolution, people were hoping that Luther and some of his ideas would also try to bring an end to feudalism and serfdom, actually specifically, and try to create social advancement for people to end feudalism. And then politically, people were hoping that he would advocate for more German autonomy from like the Holy Roman Empire and from the church. But the thing is with Luther that he was not about that. He was not for political or social revolution. And a lot of people were hoping he would, and were actually kind of disappointed that he didn't, and basically went on without him for their own political and social movements. Okay. But like, for example, there's going to be a peasant rebellion looming after this. And he, by the way, basically had to go into hiding for a while for his own life, pretty much from the church. And there were peasant rebellions at this time. And with him kind of out of the spotlight, this peasant rebellion kind of came on. Almost in a way, it almost seemed like acting like they were acting Luther names, that Luther would want an end to serfdom and would want to bring down the power of the church and this sort of thing. And one of the things that actually brought him, I believe, out of hiding was him coming out and publicly saying, no, this is not what I want. This is not what I'm supportive of. Because in a lot of ways, he kind of supported the nobles in that fact. But Luther's ideas did have social impact. For example, his teachings about women's roles Believed that women did have direct access to God, just as men could, which is not necessarily a prevailing belief at that time. He was one also that was really big into the idea of translating the Bible into the vernacular, means translating it into the language of the common people. Kind of while he was in hiding as well, he basically translated the Bible by hand into German. And because of the technology of the printing press, that got widely distributed. So literacy actually increase, not just of literacy of the Bible, because a lot of people were now reading the Bible that have never actually read it before, even if they were literate because it was written in Latin. So women's literacy increased and just literacy in general. One thing you didn't see, though, with the new Protestant churches is convents, which is basically like monasteries or a way for women, right? Nuns, for example, in Catholicism, didn't really do that. And women did not really have leadership abilities. In fact, when it comes to religious leadership, you probably saw that often more at this time with the Catholic Church than you saw with like Lutheran Church or something like that. Okay, the most important reformer after John Calvin, who overlapped with him and they discussed and communicated quite often, was John Calvin. So John Calvin was French, and he broke with the Catholic Church and had a lot of the same sort of grievances and theological issues that that Martin Luther did. Now, he will author a very important religious text. He got like the 95 Theses, for example, something you're definitely going to look at, and hopefully in your classes you're doing activities with some of Martin Luther's work. I know in my class we will be. But also, so Calvin wrote The Institutes of Christian Religion in 1536. And he is going to, again, have a lot of similar kind of beliefs with Luther, and that the Bible is so source of truth and that sort of thing. But there is one thing that he differed on, and that's basically who salvation is available to. And he, first off, basically believed in theocracy. You saw, I think, with Martin Luther a little bit more of the idea of separation of church and state in a way, but Calvin was not like that. He believed in a Christian community, okay? Basically a theocracy, meaning the church leaders are also the government leaders. Everything was kind of intertwined that way. And one of the big differences that he had preached was this idea of predestination, basically believing that before you were born and before people were born, God had determined who would be saved and who wouldn't. And that basically your life is basically living in a way that you would have been worthy almost in a way for that predestination. And because that's who God would have sort of predestined. Now, one of the key features in Calvinist communities, because they as they're going to be called Calvinists, was living together. The Calvinists lived in tight-knit communities, and they sprouted up all around. And the model community of all Calvinism was in Geneva. It's kind of interesting because he is French, but he actually did not get the immediate support in France. Where he did get it much more was in Geneva, Switzerland. Geneva, Switzerland becomes this little model city of Calvinist communities. And they lived these very plain, sort of unelaborate life, especially with their buildings. They didn't believe in the opulent architecture of like Catholic communities and stuff like that. So they kind of preached plain living. Their buildings were very simple. But again, this theocracy, this idea that the cities are governed by church leaders. Now, Calvinism became popular. His followers, especially the French ones, will be known as Huguenots, which is a term we're going to be using the rest of the term or of the lesson here. Huguenots, these French Calvinists. So, one of the big influences of Calvinism was how many offshoots of it were created. A bunch of other sects branch off of Calvinism. So early on, it's like you had in Western Europe two basically options right away for Christianity. Actually, three, I should say. Remain Catholic, become Lutheran, or become Calvinist. But as the time went on, more and more sects began to sprout up. Like, for example, the Reformed Church of Scotland. You get a group there, which again are offshoots of Calvinists. Puritans in England, who become popular there, and of course are famous for leaving England to settle their community in Boston. And Puritans, for example, they get their name because what they want to do is purify the Church of England from Catholic remnants. That's something we'll be talking about in a little bit, is the Church of England, so we'll be coming back to that. But Calvinists overall were encouraged to work hard, to reinvest their profits. They kind of have this idea of prosperity. Prosperity doctrine, which means that if you have financial prosperity, that is a sign from God that He is favoring you for your obedience and hard work. So they kind of intertwine the two. But anyways, these Christian reform efforts come to be known as the Protestant Reformation. So you get these Protestant religions, basically meaning in the pro-Protestant thing, meaning with the key word being protest and reform. Protest meaning the one commonality they'll have is protesting papal authority. They all don't believe the Pope and directly the church there has any kind of authority. And then reform because they believe in changes, right? They all want to make changes to what Catholicism had been preaching. Now, the story of the Reformation in England is a famous and interesting one, and goes around the acts and life of one man, King Henry VIII. So King Henry VIII, he ruled 1509 to 1547. His issue and where the kind of domino effect comes from with his deep desire to have a male heir. Now, his wife was not producing what he thought was not producing him male heirs. She had given birth to several daughters, and basically he thought that she was incapable of giving him a male heir. So he wanted to get basically remarried. Now, the problem is that Catholic doctrine forbids divorces. And only in a handful of times has the church actually granted what we call an annulment, or a cancellation of a marriage, basically saying it never happened. Now, Henry had a good relationship with the Pope up to this time. In fact, when Protestantism was creeping into England, he made a concerted effort to stomp that out, and actually got this title like Defender of the Faith, basically from the Pope, because of his insistence on preserving Catholicism in England. But when the Pope refused his annulment, this basically outraged him. And one of the reasons the Pope didn't do this was the reaction of his powerful ally, which was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So with this refusal of annulment, this upset him, and what he did was made an effort with basically getting the English Parliament to kind of come along, even though many disagreed with him, to basically officially take the power of the Pope away from religion in England. And they get this Act of Supremacy gets passed, which basically says whoever's the King of England is also the head of the church. So by doing this, and with kind of the pressuring of the English Parliament to pass this sort of new ordinance here, this set up again the king, and specifically Henry here, as he is now the head of what's now going to be called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Now, the Anglican Church is going to preserve many things of Catholicism, with, of course, one of the issues that he wants to get changed is ability to get an annulment, which he does. So he gets remarried to Anne Boleyn, who also, they have issues getting male children. Of course, the famous story is that Henry kept going through these wives until he could eventually get a male heir. That's where he gets, so many things famous about him. That's what people do. But that's just kind of the story of how Protestantism was created in England, was based off of this issue of Henry not getting an annulment, wanting a male heir, and eventually leading to the creation of a new religion in general. Whoop, already did this one. Okay, now let's go ahead and hop over to Russia. So Russia, of course, has had an enduring alternate form of Christianity, of Christianity outside of Catholicism now for centuries, and that was, of course, the Orthodox Church. So through the Romanov dynasty and through much of now Russian history, the Orthodox Church was integral into Russian society. They were coincided quite a bit. Now, Peter the Great, who we've talked about already in lessons, was an autocrat ruler. He was an absolute ruler that was trying to basically be the head of about every institution. And he basically wanted to assert authority by also moving against some of the authority of the church. So, for example, one of the big the biggest, basically highest ranking position in the Orthodox Church was known as the Patriarch. And he abolished that position and basically made himself and the king, who was now a head of the church as well. So basically creating a theocracy that way. But he wasn't necessarily trying to abolish Orthodox Christianity, because it's not like that, and he's still part of that and a believer in that, but incorporated the church into the Russian government. So it's like incorporating them more into the Russian government, but he's going to be at the head of it. Now, a couple of other institutions they put in was a Holy Synod, which composed of these clergymen that but were overseen by a secular official who answered to the czar. So you had this official, and it was a way for you have this church council, but it's going to be overseen by the secular government, okay, specifically the czar or the king. Now, some other things he did to weaken some of the authority of the church was a movement with the clergy. For example, he raised the minimum wage to become a monk to the age of 50. Okay, because what he didn't necessarily want was young people going right into the church leadership. He wanted them, especially young men, to pursue a military life before they go into a full monastic life. So raising up the age for that. Now, a lot of Peter's reforms were not very welcomed by peasants because it definitely didn't benefit them very much. Kind of limit some of their freedoms because church leadership and entering church leadership was a way of social mobility when you think about it. And then, of course, the old school, traditional, conservative believers of Orthodox Christianity, they opposed his reforms as well. So the next question would be, what is the Catholic Church going to do in response to this breaking apart of their church? So they embarked on a rigorous series of events known as the Counter-Reformation. Or it's called Counter-Reformation, or you just hear it called the Catholic Reformation. And the church used basically three strategies that they were hoping would keep them the dominant church in Christianity and a dominant force. So one way was they increased the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition was basically a system to root out and punish unbelievers, basically crack down on heresy in regions there. So this is something that had been going on, for a long time, but really started to amp that up and basically, it almost seems like scare people in a way, but definitely root it out and influence people that way. Also, a new sort of missionary effort was created, and that was by a group called the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus. And they were founded in 1540 and undertook big missionary efforts. And where you really saw the success of the Jesuits was when in non-Christian areas. So the Jesuits basically accompanied the conquistador efforts in the Spanish Empire. So as they were gaining an empire in North and South America, missionary efforts were huge into these areas to recruit or convert Native American people to Christianity. You also saw it with the their connections with Asia as Catholics and Catholic countries were doing trade and starting to interact with Japan and India and other parts of Asia. You saw missionary efforts coincide with that as well. Christian communities started to grow in there as well. Now, the other thing was trying to look theologically at what changes might need to be made. So over just under a 20-year period, you have what's called the Council of Trent. So they met over almost 20 years, and basically wanted to look and investigate what were the church abuses that were going on, because I think they were understanding that there were, in fact, abuses that needed to be addressed. So trying to fix those and root those out, but then also reaffirm a lot of their belief and reaffirm their rituals. So taking basically a stand there and reaffirming things. So, for example, they banned certain writings, specifically like Protestant Bibles that were coming out. Some of the other works that might challenge their doctrine, like some scientific findings, like with the works of Copernicus, started to be banned. So they were basically filtering out a lot of the literature and things and publications that were happening again. Now, as far as the effects, most people in Spain, Portugal, and France and their colonies became Catholic. They became predominantly Catholic places. And, of course, you can see this today in places that were colonies of the Spanish, Portuguese, or the French. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was, of course, the region maybe most, at least political, or a quasi-political religious institution that was most affected by the Protestant Reformation, because most of the Protestant Reformation success happened within regions of the Holy Roman Empire, like Germany, of course. And the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V basically abdicated or stepped down from his rule of emperor, basically because he was unable and able to stop the spread of Lutheranism. And that was one of the things the Roman Empire had really depended on, was the power of having that basically monopoly on religion with Catholicism there. So what ends up happening too is he steps down and kind of delegates some parts of Europe in that way. Like, for example, his son Philip II took over Spain, and his brother Ferdinand ends up becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. So just a few things that happen over there. Spain with Philip, they crusaded to the Netherlands and basically took over that. So Spain becomes basically rulers over Netherlands, and ruled over a good 17 provinces for a couple decades there. And then Philip, though, did fail, as he was basically trying to fight a war to convert England, basically, to his rule and, to Catholicism in a way, in England. And this was a huge blow for the Spanish because it was the defeat of the Spanish Armada, which was basically the greatest naval fleet in history, and it becomes such a power pull and power move and a strong arm for Spanish rule. But once that was defeated, that ended up being a huge blow to Philip and to the Spanish for the future. All right, now let's talk about wars of religion. So the religious divisions in Europe led to some of the most brutal warfare we will see in all of Europe, and won't really be matched until the violence of like the French Revolution, or eventually like the Napoleonic or World Wars. We talked about Charles V, and already talked about how he was unable to basically stop the spread of Lutheranism. So you do get the Peace of Augsburg eventually, that he has to delegate after years and years of warfare. So the Peace of Augsburg was in 1555. Basically what it ended up deciding was that the leader of the specific, like, German prince or whatever, the leader of a German state, was basically able to choose if their region wanted to be Catholic. Sorry, this isn't supposed to say Catholic or German. Catholic or Lutheran. Sorry, this should say Lutheran, not German. They're always going to be German. German states are going to be German. Sorry about that. But yeah, Catholic or Lutheran. That was basically the only job. Now, what this ended up doing, though, was it looks like it's like religious freedom. But the issue was, let's say you were in one of these German states, and their leadership said that you were going to be a Lutheran. That then applied to everybody in the state. That Lutheranism was going to be the official religion of the state. And the only way to freely, I guess, practice your religion would be to move to a different state. And that practices whatever religion you are. So if you were a Catholic in a Lutheran state, you probably wanted to leave. Or if you're a Lutheran in a Catholic state, you basically had to meet too. But the Peace of Augsburg was basically a compromise in a way. Sorry, one sec. Okay. All right. Now, how about over in France? Now, France had a very difficult issue because the church was so powerful in France, and that French monarchs were generally on that side too. You know what I mean? So for the next about 50 years, right, Catholics and Huguenots, who are French Protestants, specifically Calvinists, they were fighting each other basically for 50 years. And the monarchy was constantly trying to sort of deal with that. And in kind of a political, quasi-religious move, King Henry IV actually converted. He was basically had grown up a Protestant and converted to Catholicism in hoping that it would help unify France, because France was very Catholic as well. And about 5 years later, he issued what's called the Edict of Nantes. And basically what that did was allowed officially for Huguenots or French Protestants to practice their faith, because it had been kind of basically been illegal up to that point. And for the next about 87 years, Protestants, or just France in general, people could practice, their religion that they wanted. So it provided religious tolerance for the next 87 years there. Now, later on, Louis XIV, maybe the most powerful French king in history, he actually revoked it because he was a staunch Catholic. So he revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, and persecution of Huguenots increased. What it actually led to, and this is actually going to be a big problem down this in the years following, was a lot of these French Protestants ended up leaving France. And the issue for that is that it had huge social and economic problems. For example, a lot of these Protestants, right, these French Protestants, were skilled people. They were skilled in craftsmanship or a lot of other things. They were integral into the economy of France. So when they left, that was a huge social and economic blow actually to them. But again, they were leaving to try to get more religious freedoms. Okay, so the probably most famous of the religious wars as a result of the Protestant Reformation was known as the 30 Years' War. So this was a conflict that lasted basically roughly 30 years between Catholics and Protestants. And this will be maybe the most devastating wars in European history there. It created a total economic catastrophe. It was responsible for famine, for starvation, for disease. And it started out as a religious issue because it started out with the whole Protestantism within the Holy Roman Empire thing. So you had this kind of fight between them and the Holy Roman Empire. You have this going on. But then it started becoming not just a religious thing, but just a general conflict involving multiple European powers. So again, starts with this religious thing that just becomes more of a traditional European conflict. And some of the destruction actually was amplified for the fact that a lot of the troops that were recruited into fighting in the 30 Years' War were basically promised and encouraged, or I guess enticed, I guess, to join fighting this war because what they basically said was that these troops could loot the places that they conquer. So you go and loot a Catholic village or you loot a Protestant village. And when you devastate it and you destroy the place, you go and loot their stuff, right? Go burn down a church, take all their relics, these sort of things. So this amplified the destruction even more. Now, what actually ended up with this war? So again, it's 30 years of just pure brutality. It ended with what's called the Peace of Westphalia. That's definitely one you know. I should have, I think I meant to bold that, okay, there. But it kind of, to continue on with already the theme that had kind of been going on ever since some of these issues and going back to like Peace of Augsburg and some of that stuff earlier, was basically trying to come down with religious policy. So what it did was allowed areas of the Holy Roman Empire to practice one of three forms of Christianity. And those were the only options. It wasn't other ones. You had to still officially be Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist. So this allowed areas to sort of do that. Now, as a result of the 30 Years' War, France, Spain, and Italy will predominantly still be made of Catholics. That's not going to change much. Especially in Spain and Italy, the two countries that the Reformation probably had the least impact on. Northern Europe will basically just be Lutheran and Calvinist, as Catholicism really kind of faded away. And then England, just to recap, is going to still be a Protestant church, right? But remember, they are a state church. The church, or the state, runs the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Now, one of the things that definitely was an effect too politically was what effect it had on European leaders. The ability for a leader or some kind of ruler here to decide the religious domination of their state is a huge tool of autonomy that leaders did not have before throughout the Middle Ages. Having that kind of autonomy was a big tool, right, to be able to use there. Excuse me. So, for example, as a result of the 30 Years' War, the necessity that states felt now that they had to be able to militarily protect themselves. What you saw was a huge bump up in military superiority and military preparedness, specifically in Prussia and Austria. That after the war here, they became really assertive militarily as, while still belonging to the Holy Roman Empire, became far more militarily assertive because they wanted to develop a strong military to basically protect itself from future conflicts. And, Prussia and Austria become, military powers as a result of this eventually. Now let's head out of Europe and head east into the Islamic world. So the three big, if you have been following with the topics thus far, the three gunpowder Islamic empires there: the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire over in India. So let's look at the belief systems and what's kind of going on over there. Now, with the huge monumental effect and moment that was the Ottoman Empire taking over Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantine Empire and much of that region around Constantinople now officially basically converted to being predominantly Islamic. And especially after the takeover of the city. The Byzantine emperor was ended, or his position was abolished, and of course this was the end of really the remnant of the Holy Roman Empire, and that then was replaced by the Sultan, or the sort of king of the Ottoman Empire, who's Islamic. Now, one of the things that definitely replaced it was Islamic religious law, known as Sharia law. This replaced the law code that had been around for centuries in the Byzantine Empire, which was Justinian code, Justinian's law code that the Emperor Justinian had imposed, and had been around now for centuries. Now, Sharia law is a strict Islamic legal system that deals with all aspects of life outside of religion. They're religious as well as affect some of the non-religious things. So, for example, it was laid out in criminal justice. So you saw these religious elements of religious doctrine becoming part of the criminal justice system, martial laws, as well as things like property and inheritance laws. Sharia law became the encompassing law form for this region. Now, with the Safavid Empire, remember one of the key differences between the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Empire was the whole Sunni-Shiite split, where Ottoman Empire, although multi-ethnic and even multi-Islamic sect, having Sunni and Shia, I believe were more on the Sunni side of things. But the Safavids, what separated them, of course, was their insistence on Shia Islam, right? And we're using that basically as a unifying force, that this is going to be a Shia Islamic state. They denied legitimacy to any Sunni. And this strict adherence to Shia Islam and, in a way, kind of persecution or persecution toward Sunni Islam was something that the Ottoman Empire really disagreed with, and made the Ottoman Empire and the Safavids long enemies that had basically been fighting over territorial and theological issues between the Sunni Shiite split. They're going to fight for a good 200 years. So Sunni Empire basically versus a Shia Empire. Now, over in India, they have a unique scenario because, unlike the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire in India, citizenship was not predominantly Muslim, as it was predominantly Hindu and other religions as well. So the Mughal Empire reached a lot of their peak and their kind of most famous of their years of rule under Akbar, the grandson of the original first Mughal emperor who established the dynasty, Babur. And Akbar was known for being tolerant of religions. You know, might have seen that since he is, and his dynasty is Islamic, trying to completely enforce Islamic adherence in a Hindu state would be a bad idea. So he tolerated basically all religions. He was known for giving money or land to people, Hindus and Muslims, even gave money to have a Catholic church built in Goa. So you see that as well. Also provided land grants for the new religion that had kind of come as a result of the Hindu and Islam kind of mix. Now remember, Islam predates the Mughals in India. It had come in earlier. But a newer religion that had been created was Sikhism, which shares a lot of elements between Hinduism and Islam in this kind of new religion that, again, blended some of that. So developed from Hinduism with Islamic influence into it as well. Now, it was generally seen as monotheistic, but one of the big characteristics of Sikhs was that they recognized the rights of other faiths to exist, so not attempting necessarily to abolish other beliefs in that way. And in fact, Sikhism is far more popular actually today than people realize. It's the fifth most popular religion in the world by the 21st century. So by the 21st century, it's the fifth most popular religion in the world. Now, Akbar also gave Hindus positions in government, so they were in high positions in his court and things like that. Also exempted them from poll taxes paid by non-Muslims. One thing you find in some of the Islamic empires was the jizya tax, where they would impose a tax on non-Muslims in their kingdom as a way to probably encourage conversion, or at the very least provide a source of revenue. And that's not something he was putting in, which will not be the case, though, necessarily for later Mughal emperors. That's why kind of what they say, kind of this most successful age of the Mughal Empire was when they acted actually the most tolerant of the local religions. Okay. Now, to go along with that, Akbar encouraged learning, art, architecture, and literature. He also tried to prohibit some centuries-old practices in India, although he had failed to do it. So, for example, he failed in trying to prohibit child marriages, which was a common thing in India, with kind of the strict nature of the caste system in a way too, was arranging marriages, and starting from childhood and within your caste and things like that. Also tried to end and kind of abolish the practice of sati. Now, sati is this ritual that when an Indian man dies, okay, and dies before his wife does, that the widow would basically was kind of encouraged in a way to kill themselves, because what they would do is they would burn the body in what's called a funeral pyre of the husband, and it was this ritual that the women would basically join that husband by putting themselves into the fire, thus being killed in that process. But that failed to do that. He also failed to convert Hindus and Muslims basically to a new religion also that was kind of attempted, which was simply just kind of translates as the divine faith, which tried to reconcile Hinduism and Islam. He tried to find a way that, although, I mean, there's so many differing things about Hinduism and Islam. I mean, you've got polytheism versus monotheism, and a caste system versus spiritual equality. And he tried to find some kind of conciliation between the two and trying to create a unity in religion that way. But that did end up failing as well. And then the last thing here today is another effect that of religion in a way, or something that will have an effect on religion. And that was that within the Protestant Reformation and some of the most heated times of the Reformation, within the Inquisition and the Catholic Reformation and the Protestant Reformation, was a scientific revolution. So the scientific revolution at its core philosophy that separated it was the emphasis on reason over faith, of trying to achieve knowledge, right? And some of the ideas behind it you're going to see kind of come out, but a couple things to just kind of note for this was in 1620, the English scientist slash philosopher Francis Bacon, who developed something that's going to be a core tenet for the scientific revolution, and that is what's called empiricism. It's basically an early scientific method. Empiricism basically, it insists that data and collecting data needs to happen to back up any kind of hypothesis. You have to have data to back up a hypothesis. Okay, you have to have that. And what he ended up doing in this kind of process too was challenging a lot of traditional ideas that may not have had, up to his idea, meeting its burden of proof with data. So we're basically challenging these traditional ideas and replacing them with ideas that he believed was demonstrable through evidence. Okay, so this it's kind of a precursor again to the scientific method that we know of later on. So just a few other things, because a lot of things you can look at into the scientific revolution, but just to highlight a couple of the other points here, was the establishment of scientific academies. You saw this at the Royal Academy of Science in France, you see it in England, and these places became hotbeds for scientific discoveries and using kind of this proto-scientific method. A lot of them were people that were improving upon works of previous people. So like Sir Isaac Newton, for example, he was combining Galileo's laws of terrestrial motion. So that was a big part, by the way, you remember, of the Inquisition, of Galileo's whole idea of Earth revolving around the sun and orbits and planetary orbits and stuff like that, which challenged a lot of beliefs, which, if you know the story with Galileo, he was pressured to recant those statements because it was church doctrine that the Earth was kind of the literal center of the universe. and basically forced him to a kind of house arrest to recant his statements. But anyways, what Isaac Newton had done was combine Galileo's laws of terrestrial motion and then Johannes Kepler's laws of planetary motion for Isaac Newton's famous work on the force of gravity, right? Which he gets published here in his piece of literature, Principia, in 1687. Now, just overall, the big effect of the scientific revolution was this idea that with the success of science, because the scientific revolution broke a lot of grounds and a lot of scientific discoveries, that many intellectuals thought that science showed that the world was ordered, okay? That the world was ordered by laws, rational laws, natural laws, and that these exist. Just like you have these laws of gravity and these scientific things, proofs, and everything is ordered by these laws, that those laws also apply and can be applicable to human connotations. So governments, to society, right? And this is going to influence what's called the Enlightenment, which is going to be a topic for another unit. But the success of science got people to think that you can find natural laws that govern people and govern governments. There is a best way to order society, and there's a best way to order government, basically through using the scientific method that you can sort of prove what is that best model. But that is more for another time, but that's just to introduce a little bit of what some of the influence is going to be. All right, then, with that, everybody, that is going to wrap this up. Let's just revisit before we go the essential question. So the essential question derived from the objective that AP has set out for you. You need to have, after having studied this topic, be able to answer this question with detailed evidence. And that is, how did different belief systems endure or change during the period from 1450 to 1750? Okay, I know in my class, I have the students write a written response to this. It would be good that you would do that too. If you can respond to this, even think of it like an LEQ, or at the very least, a short answer question. Can you answer this with evidence? And after today, after reading hopefully your texts, hopefully you got a nice review here and the materials that you're using, you can answer this with evidence. If this prompts up or comes up on a test, whether it's in in some kind of writing form, that you can answer this with evidence. That is your goal for today. So if you feel like you can do this comfortably, go ahead and try it. If you don't, get back to your material and dig that up, because it's definitely going to be on the test. Okay? All right. With that, let's go ahead and get ready to close out. Just taking a look at the live audience here. By the way, if you're probably most likely watching this as a recording, but stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, because when I do these lessons, I record them live. Gives you an opportunity to kind of be a part of a live community. We usually have an active chat and things like that. Also, as a way you can, if you join, you can possibly ask questions through our donation service. I offer this course for free, this college level course for free. Donations, though, are extremely appreciated. Never required, but of course appreciated. A few ways you can do that. One, if you come to one of our live lessons, use the super chat function in YouTube. You can ask me a question that I will get to in the lesson. It also highlights and saves your message so that I can see that, but also provides a donation to the channel. Another way you can do that is through Streamlabs. There's a link to that in the description that you can do as well. As far as just general support of the channel, another way you can support my channel is by joining Patreon. One of the perks of Patreon on my channel is to vote on videos that I get to check out and react to. All donators, or of all pledge levels, have the ability to vote in those polls, but that's a great way too. Another final way that I would definitely encourage you, especially if you're a history student or just a fan of history in general, is to join our Discord server. At the time that I've recorded this, there are now there's about 3,100 Discord members that are on there, history fans. I even made a channel specifically for AP students on Discord. So definitely check that out, and you can talk with other students and get through this whole thing together. You are not alone. Okay, with that then, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Let me just take one more final look. All right, with that, just encourage you again. If you're in Unit 3 now, you're into the heart of AP World History. Keep good study habits, stay on schedule, keep a routine, and hold yourself to it. Okay? Ask questions when you are struggling. The education is in your hands. Don't expect it to be spoon-fed by someone else. Okay? You are in control. All right, with that, you can do it. I promise you can. You'll get through this and try to have some fun with it. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and call it here, and we'll see you next time.